Container home versus granny flat. People use these terms interchangeably all the time in Australia, but they actually mean very different things. And confusing the two can lead to buying the wrong product, applying for the wrong approval, or ending up with something your council won't sign off on. This video clears it up. Let's start with what each term actually means. A granny flat is a planning term. It refers to a secondary dwelling on the same residential lot as a primary home. It's defined by its relationship to the main property, it's subordinate to it, it sits on the same land, and it's governed by secondary dwelling rules in your state's planning legislation. A granny flat can be built from timber, brick, steel, or a modular system. The construction method doesn't define it. The planning classification does. A container home is a construction method. It refers to a dwelling built using a steel frame modular or shipping container structure. A container home can be a primary residence on its own lot, a secondary dwelling on someone else's lot, a granny flat, a holiday cabin, a home office, or a workforce accommodation unit. The term describes how it's built, not where it sits in the planning system. So a container home and a granny flat are not opposites. A container home can be a granny flat. In fact, that's one of the most popular uses for modular container homes in Australia right now. Here's where it gets practical. If you want to add a secondary dwelling to your existing residential property, something a family member can live in, or that you can rent out, the planning system calls that a granny flat or secondary dwelling. Whether you build it from brick or buy a modular container home kit, you're applying under the same secondary dwelling rules. The approval pathway is the same. The size limits are the same. The rental rules are the same. The difference is in how you build it. A traditional granny flat takes months to construct on site. A modular container home can be installed in weeks. It arrives largely pre-built, cranes onto your prepared slab or footings, and connections are made on site. For most homeowners, that speed and simplicity is the main reason to choose a modular container home over a traditionally built secondary dwelling. Now, what about a container home as a primary residence, not a granny flat? If you're buying land and putting a container home on it as your main home, you're not in secondary dwelling territory at all. You're building a primary residence, and the approval process is closer to a standard building permit. Your home needs to comply with the National Construction Code, sit on appropriately zoned land, and connect to services or have approved off-grid alternatives. The container home is still the construction method, but the planning classification is simply a dwelling, not a secondary dwelling. A few things worth knowing if you're comparing your options. On cost, a modular container home used as a granny flat typically comes in 30 to 40% cheaper than a traditionally built secondary dwelling of the same size, and it's on site in weeks rather than months. On approval, both a traditionally built granny flat and a modular container home granny flat go through the same secondary dwelling approval process in your state. Western Australia, New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia have all recently made that process faster and more accessible. On flexibility, a modular container home has one major advantage a traditional granny flat doesn't: it's relocatable. If you sell the property or want to move it, you can.
Now, mate.
A brick granny flat stays where it is. And on perception, some councils and neighbours are more comfortable with a modular home that looks like a modern dwelling than a raw shipping container. If aesthetics or council attitude is a concern in your area, a purpose-built modular home with appropriate cladding and finishes is a much easier approval than a bare container. The bottom line, a container home is a construction method, a granny flat is a planning classification, and the two overlap significantly. If you want to add a secondary dwelling to your property quickly and affordably, a modular container home is one of the best ways to do it. If you want a standalone primary residence, a container home works for that too, just under different planning rules. The link in the description takes you to our full range of modular and container homes for both uses. Thanks for watching.